How relevant are the teachings of ancient philosophers for modern problems? Marcus Aurelius didn't have social media. The Buddha never got stuck in bumper-to-bumper traffic. At first glance, the stressors of modern life seem so different from what humans had to deal with a few hundred or especially a few thousand years ago. Well, in today's episode of the Psychedelic Therapy Frontiers podcast, we discuss how and why the principles taught by ancient philosophers are relevant and helpful for addressing our uniquely modern problems. We also explore a few modern philosophies and discuss how philosophy and the practice of psychotherapy overlap. For those of you who are new to the show, welcome. Psychedelic Therapy Frontiers is brought to you by Numinous Network and is hosted by me, Dr. Steve Thayer, and my co-host, Dr. Reid Robison. Just a few announcements really quick before we get into the episode. It's not too late to sign up for the next cohort of our Fundamentals of Psychedelic-Assisted Therapy course. We run 2 simultaneous cohorts on Tuesdays and Fridays. So cohort 1 starts on February 7th and cohort 2 starts on February 11th. So if you're looking for comprehensive foundational training that includes live online classes, experiential learning, and opportunities to connect with a diverse community of practitioners in the psychedelic medicine space, then check out our course. We're offering 10% off of the course to PTF podcast listeners. So click on the link in the show notes or go directly to numinous.com/training, and you can use the code PTF10 for 10% off the course. If you've listened to the show for a while, you've heard Reid and I talk about the psychedelic clinical trial work that Numinous Network does. If you or someone you know might be interested in being a participant in a psychedelic clinical trial, you can click on the link in the show notes or go directly to numinous.com/research to learn more about the trials we're currently running. If you'd like to support our show, here's how you do it. You can leave us a rating or review in places like Apple Podcasts and Spotify. If you're watching on YouTube, you can like the video, subscribe to the channel, and of course, please share the episode with somebody you think might enjoy it. Without further delay, here is our episode today on ancient wisdom for modern problems. So, Reid, I've heard it said that if you want to learn something new, read something old. And
the irony of that.
Sounds true enough.
Yeah. Why is old stuff good?
Well, I think one way to think about it is a lot of the struggles we deal with in so-called modern life are not so modern. Like, human beings have been human beings for a long time. And some of the things that perturb us today, if not almost all, are things that perturbed people hundreds, thousands of years ago. Mm-hmm. And we've got all this ancient, what feels ancient to us, philosophy to inform us about what those struggles were like. And maybe there is gold to be mined about how to deal with modern problems in some of those ancient ideas, philosophies, and texts.
Maybe. Shall we?
Let's test that theory.
Meander and see.
Yeah.
But I think about that now and then I see it written out there in big media articles and by all sorts of different people, just that observation that even though we're in very different times, the same common themes seem to keep reoccurring. And I think it makes sense too, because the details of the modern challenges differ, but the struggles are pretty much the same, and the things we want, like love and friendship and security and tranquility and things like that, are not new.
Right.
And the thing about ancient philosophers, the ancient part of the equation is that we can literally build on the shoulders and the deep thinking of giants, because so many iterations have passed, and of course they got many things wrong along the way, right? Like was it Aristotle who said the Earth was the center of the universe, for example, right? But if I were plopped down here without a telescope, I mean, what would I think? I'd be a flat earther for a minute, right? Yeah, like I looked this up recently, 2 to 10% of the United States of America.
Yeah. So, I mean, there are empirical things that change as we gain more evidence and our tools for investigating the nature of reality and self improve. And then there's just sort of the reality of what it's like to be a human being in this meat puppet trying to navigate this world. Yeah. And so wherever we go, we bring our psyches with us. And maybe not a lot has changed about the human psyche over the last several hundred years, even though the information that we have is, more thorough than it's ever been.
It's expanding a wee bit these days.
Makes you wonder what people in the future will look back on and say that we got wrong, right?
Chat GPT.
Yeah, people. I'm assuming it's people looking back. Maybe it's going to be our AI overlords looking back.
Yeah. But the other thing that I think is a constant, perhaps even hardwired into us, is this innate longing to ask the big, deep philosophical questions.
To understand.
Such as, why the hell am I here?
Mm-hmm.
Like, who am I? Mm-hmm. And what is the purpose of this?
Yeah. And why do I feel so bad?
Yeah.
And you hear like evolutionary psychologists and theorists talk about how we evolved not for happiness, we evolved for survival, that a lot of the mechanisms that are at play in our psyches aren't necessarily there to make us content. And if they may actually be there to make us not content, so that negativity bias is an example of that, right?
Yeah.
We pay attention to something that could harm us rather than sort of resting and appreciating the things that we already have.
Yeah. So I love looking to philosophy for mental health struggles, and you have to do it with a bit of a filter. There are many different philosophies or systems or approaches, many different viewpoints, and I think, one thing we may land on, we'll see, is just some ways you might integrate some different thoughts into your own viewpoint. Mm-hmm. That can be like your compass for navigating these rough existential waters, if you will.
Yeah. It's the way I think of psychotherapy, like different approaches to psychotherapy. They are philosophies, they're theories, and informed by some empirical science, but still very much philosophical and theoretical.
Yeah, and there's a lot of overlap too. I mean, psychology technically, is the study of the human mind and behavior. Mm-hmm. And philosophy, well, my favorite definition, old one from an old guy, Pythagoras, was the love of wisdom. Yeah. I mean, it's a simple way, but it's, I mean, well, how do you put philosophy in this overlapping big picture of psychotherapy, psychology, and spirituality?
Yeah, that's another one too, right? Well, I started my undergraduate thinking I was going to be a philosophy major.
Hey, me too.
Yeah.
What do you know?
It's not, I don't think it's an uncommon pathway for people who end up in the mental health profession to start with just curiosity about what it's like to be human.
Yeah.
So I remember being really curious about philosophy, and I think my hope was maybe if I study these ancient thinkers, I'll figure out my own problems, or I'll figure out the truth, the capital T truth of being and existence.
Then you saw psychology offering a fast track to your own problems.
Kind of, yeah. Well, it was more like, my dad saying, how are you going to make money as a philosophy major, basically? Yeah. What are you doing?
That is a consideration. The question I had is, what does one do? One teaches.
Right. Yeah. You learn old ideas so that you can teach them to new people.
And teach,
which I love teaching, but I saw psychology and eventually clinical psychology as kind of an applied philosophy.
Yeah.
So a way to I still get to study these cool ideas, but I get to study them through the lens of how can we use these cool ideas to help people who struggle? And of course, the self-interested lens, how can I use them to help myself in my struggles? That's kind of how I moved from philosophy to clinical psychology. I thought for a moment there that I would be a theoretical psychologist. There was like this really unique major at BYU where I went that you could do that. But it was, again, a pathway to more teaching.
Yeah. Yeah, I remember taking my first philosophy class and being equal parts like enamored and intrigued, but also the teacher matters a lot in these things. And just not having one that jived with me helped bump me into what was a new major that showed up. I was at BYU as well, a bit before you, I guess. I don't know if we didn't even overlap.
Probably. I mean, I was there forever because I did both my undergraduate and my PhD there.
I left in 2005.
Yeah, I was there. I started in 2004, but then I went on a Mormon mission for a couple of years. Yeah. So graduated with my bachelor's in 2007. And then
I saw you as a freshman waving.
Wave goodbye.
Yeah, but after I started college, they came out with the neuroscience major, so I jumped in as a guinea pig. Probably similar reasons. We haven't even really talked about this for some strange reason, because we've talked a lot.
Yeah, we have had a lot of conversations.
Yeah, but I jumped into that. It was more of an applied version of what I was searching for, I guess, but also applied and practical, perhaps.
Yeah, I considered medical school. I considered neuroscience as a potential pathway. The worst grade I ever got as an undergrad was biology 100, though. And so I was like, man, maybe not.
Yeah.
And then I had a very influential professor at BYU who was sort of the chair of this theoretical psychology path. And he was, BYU is owned by the Mormon Church. There's a lot of religious professors. He was not LDS, though, but he was very religious. And he would teach us about materialism, like as a way of as something to avoid, like biological materialism. Don't reduce human beings to meat machines. And so he's very critical of neuropsychological interpretations of what it means to be a person. And at the time, that was really influential to me. I'm like, yeah, we're not just meat puppets. We have agency. We have free will. There's more things that are mysterious about the human mind than can be explained by just looking at synapses and neurons and neural anatomy. And so that's kind of what put me off the trail for medical school and neuroscience for a while.
Yeah. And then here we are. I'm thinking like mid-career. I don't know what stage we're in, but early mid, we encountered this psychedelic field that happens to bring in a lot of philosophy and spirituality back into the equation, for sure. Like, think about the values card sorting task as an example that you can look up, and it's open source by some professors. And I've used it for several years in retreats and some private ketamine-assisted psychotherapy retreats and sessions with individuals, couples, families, whatever. But where you essentially have this stack of values and you go through them and pick out the ones that jump out at you, and then you pick your top list of however many. And it actually showed up in one of our clinical trial protocols from one of the study sponsors as part of the preparation process before a dosing session, which I thought was super cool. And I've seen it show up on dosing day, laid out in front of someone, helping to remind them of their intentions. And so, yeah, I think that's an example of philosophy showing up in mental health work, wouldn't you say?
Yeah, of course. Like the exercise of setting an intention for psychedelic psychotherapy is a philosophical exercise, right? It's one where you're asking yourself perhaps those big questions.
Yeah.
Like, what do I want out of life? Why am I not getting it? Why am I struggling in this way? If I want to change, why do I want to change, and how do I want to change? And then, the answers to those questions are going to be heavily influenced by your values, and your values could be philosophically informed, right?
Yeah. Yeah. And as I was thinking about why I like philosophy so much, one of the reasons is because it helps you live with more intentionality, I feel. So I'm glad you brought up setting an intention, because that's really a great example of like going within and finding the deep questions, the deep longings, and bringing them out into the real world and working on it. Like philosophers of old would talk about working on character or virtue.
Right.
Like embracing more courage, for example.
Yeah, and mentioning the values card sort made me think of acceptance and commitment therapy, because you asked me earlier about philosophies influencing psychotherapies. And when I was first getting trained in ACT, that's when I was introduced to this interesting fusion of cognitive behavioral therapy and mindfulness. And a lot of people will say that CBT heavily influenced by Stoic philosophy, looking at the assumptions that you're making, the cognitive distortions, and detaching yourself a bit from the emotions that those things trigger that could be inconsistent with reality, right? And then you have this Eastern influence of mindfulness and presence and compassionate acceptance and detachment from your desires or aversions. And ACT focuses heavily on doing that work so that you can live a values-focused life.
Yeah, I like that because what is it? The third wave? Mm-hmm. No, second wave.
They called ACT third wave psychotherapy, but yeah.
And then so DBT and CBT would fall under
third wave.
Yeah, and with the foundation of mindfulness, but ACT really drives home the values part of it, which I think is its special sauce, right?
Yeah.
That and the
fusion,
the radical acceptance. Yeah, the fusion. Like you were saying, we both, I think, take this approach to psychotherapy is bringing in multiple frameworks. And we like evidence-based ones where possible, where they exist, and relying on, standing on the shoulders of giants and all the work that's been done before. But it is nice to be able to pull those in and be not rigidly living in one path and one framework only, which I appreciate.
Yeah. You're making me think of another reason that I was attracted to philosophy that didn't necessarily pan out. And that was the hope that I would find something to rigidly adhere to, that I could have complete confidence in, explained all the confusing things that gave me answers to those questions.
Nice.
And now I can't help but be an eclectic psychologist, meaning that, like you described, take from multiple different ways of doing things, theories of mind, theories of reality, theories of what makes up the good life. Because at least in my mind, none of the theories sort of siloed provide satisfactory answers and direction.
And I think you need to go kind of far down that road to really come to that realization. Or I'm just thinking of this line I read in a book once, and I've shared on here, that I'm still trying to make sense of, is enlightenment is following one thing through to the end. Or like we've said even more recently, pick a practice, a framework, and go deep. And I think in that you really kind of take it on. You gotta try it on. In addition to having good skeptical eyes through which to evaluate things at first, but you got to try it on and see if it works, and then you kind of understand the limitations and the gaps and the holes, or know where there's some contradictions that need adjustment.
Yeah, I think wisdom to some degree is knowing what to discard, knowing what to ignore.
Yeah.
But it's hard to know what to discard or ignore if you don't pick it up and look at it first. Now, there are some things that doesn't apply to. I don't feel like I need to know what cocaine feels like in order to make an informed decision about whether or not I ever use cocaine. But yeah, generally speaking, with these philosophies, it does really pay off to dive into it and get a thorough understanding of it so that you can compare and contrast to your lived experience and your values before you discard things.
Yeah. That reminds me of your cocaine example, reminds me of what I've heard said about heroin, that I have never tried and do not have any desire to, even though people say it's like kissing God. Which sounds kind of philosophical, a bit mystical.
I wonder what it's like to kiss God, but I'll look for other avenues.
Yeah.
Heroin seems to be, that avenue seems to be paved with peril.
From through a philosophical lens, or from that standpoint, how does that inform you never deciding that you do not need to or will not try cocaine or heroin?
Yeah. I mean, it's related to just your point about trying to thoroughly understand something before you know you want to pick it up and put it down. There are some things that involve enough value inconsistent risks for me that I can learn about through other people's experience or through looking at the data, that I feel like I can make an informed enough decision. And there's too much to be experienced in the world to experience it all.
Yeah.
Unless you're on a certain psychedelic drug, I guess. But So yeah, who was it that said, it might have been Cornfield, like tend to the part of the garden that you can touch.
I like that.
So I can't touch the entire garden. I can't care about everything. I can't investigate everything in this short existence on this planet. So I'm going to use my values as a compass and just sort of follow my curiosity, discarding the things that look dangerous enough that my curiosity isn't piqued thoroughly.
Yeah. So for many people these days in this, like I'm thinking of this psychedelic renaissance, it's not a matter of legality. It is for some, but and for others, that will I try this substance, yes or no? It's very different for most people when they look at psilocybin versus one of those much scarier illicit street drugs, let's say. And we can kind of say that somewhat objectively now because of all the data that's out on it. Right. But for me, it's interesting to look at it. It kind of stems from one of the nuggets of like philosophical thinking and stances that I've picked up along the way of like using this awareness of anything that I'm going to consume or take in my body, of why or what is my purpose consuming that, or what is my intention, or just trying to do that with food and with like, am I going to use something once or several times? You know what I mean? Yeah. Why is it going into my body?
Yeah. I think that's a good description of what philosophy, some of the philosophies we're talking about, has to offer. It makes me think of the word mindfulness. You know, what does it mean to be mindful as opposed to mindless? It means maybe paying attention. And the Stoics talk about thoughtful, right? Yeah. But full of thought, as where you're really paying attention and you're being intentional. And the Stoics talk about how a lot of our suffering comes from just sort of being jerked around by our impulses. Yeah. And that to live a good life, we need to be paying attention and noticing that when we have an impulse that maybe wants us to avoid or approach something, that in the long run isn't really healthy for us or is inconsistent with our virtues or our values or ethics, that we can then not relent, not give up volitional control to these instincts that might not serve the greater good.
Yeah. And you mentioned Cornfield briefly, but he's an example of someone, just as an aside, who is a psychologist, and I'd argue like a spiritual philosopher, if you will, but has gone deep down a couple paths of Hinduism and, say, Buddhism, and now teaches this framework that integrates both, I'd say, like someone like Tara Brach does. She would call herself a Buddhist psychologist. She's the one who wrote, for those listening, Radical Acceptance, for example, a great book. And Jack Cornfield is one who wrote, we've mentioned it on here before, he's written many things, but After Ecstasy, The Laundry, for example. Yeah.
And he's not referring to the drug ecstasy, or is he?
No. I mean, I think it's a play on words that even back then, it's not that old of a book, but it was before Lycos was born, right? But yeah, I think it's a play on words. But in the book, he talks about the ecstasy of, like, say, a transformative retreat that you've traveled far to at the top of a mountain, and then what do you do as you come back down that mountain? Yeah. And drugs or not, it doesn't really, like we've talked about here, it doesn't really matter in the end. We're talking about the experience of transcendence and transformation.
Ecstasis. Yeah, another sort of pithy phrases and slogans we've used come to mind, like before enlightenment, chop wood, carry water. After enlightenment, chop wood, carry water. Yeah. There's a sense of, what's the word I'm looking for? Like, what is it? Just the ordinariness of life, tedium of life.
Yeah. And those are super fun. I've been thinking about today with this topic in mind, even the example of Zen koans, that if you're practicing Zen Buddhism or dabbling in it even, you'll encounter these things, these little riddles that can
tickle the psyche a little bit.
Yeah, tickle the psyche and offer either a fast or very slow or anything in between path to insight as you sit with this puzzle. And we give some examples, but apart from that, I'm thinking of even like Jesus, and when he's telling his disciples, "Eat my flesh and blood," was that literal? Was that a riddle? But that offered some kind of, experience of instant insight or enlightening if one is open to it about what that could mean. And it could mean lots of different things based on where your psyche is receiving it from.
Yeah, riddles and stories are a really interesting way to communicate philosophy and give people a stimulus for introspection. The parables of Jesus and there are things that overlap with other philosophies. Consider the lilies of the field; they toil not, et cetera, et cetera. Mm-hmm. It sounds very Buddhist in some ways.
Yeah, and all the modern day proverbs, the old ones, like, Rome wasn't built in a day, or in Italian, Roma non fu fatta in un giornata.
Oh, stop showing off.
And I won't say it in French, but
oh gosh,
it's not a French saying. So those like Joseph Campbell's stories, like I just love journey. Anything. I just love hearing him speak or reading his books too. But I just love hearing the stories that he pulls from like philosophies from far and wide. Yeah.
And stories are awesome for a lot of reasons, but because you can revisit them at different time periods in your life and get something new out of them. Mm-hmm. Same can be said of all these philosophies. There are things in my 20s that were really, really important for me to understand and that stood out to me. And I was just talking to my wife about this today, that I look back on, I'm like, I have no curiosity about that at all. And part of that's because maybe I've gone down that road and found what I wanted, but it's also because it's relative to where I am. I'm looking at those things from a different vantage point in my life and from who I am and how I've changed. Yeah.
I don't even know who said the quote about returning from your explorations with new eyes. Is kind of, we do see the world through a different lens at different times of our life, for sure. Mm-hmm. Yeah. But I wanted to circle back to one thing you touched on that I think was an early theme in like the ancient, say, Greco-Roman philosophers of pleasure or hedonism, as we might call it in psychological disciplines. We've even named the hedonic treadmill.
Right. Or a symptom of depression is anhedonia, right?
Yeah. So this concept of pleasure kind of acknowledges that humans are wired, very significantly wired for, avoiding pain and death and moving towards survival, meaning food and sex, the propagation of species. And that's, of course, mediated by our wiring and neurotransmitters and that feel-good molecule of more and motivation, dopamine. But hedonism is something that like these dueling schools of philosophy wrestled with one school saying, okay, we just need to embrace the pleasures because we're wired this way and kind of hack our lives to not get stuck in them. Mm-hmm. And then others taking, like building on that. But I think that's maybe one of the core age-old struggles that certainly shows up in problematic ways in mental health, for sure.
Yeah, and you see modern takes on it with the sort of self-discipline bros on Instagram, optimization, or even from a religious perspective, perhaps, or a philosophical perspective of hedonic indulgence leads to suffering, and you get asceticism, where you deny yourself of all pleasures, and that's how you find enlightenment, by destroying the flesh. Right?
Yeah, it reminds me of in the book. I think I have a book behind the screen behind me that is called Holy Anorexia, and talks about the history of eating disorders. But some of it goes way back to like 500 CE. The words BC and AD have been canceled. So
BCE and
CE,
yeah,
like
Common
Era, or some people, if they still want to call it before Christian era, but yeah, it was chock full of Christianity. So it's been like adapted in front of our eyes over like since we were in school, right?
Yeah, for sure.
But say 500 after Christ's time, in the Christianity that ensued, there was a lot of that. Like I remember quotes from certain saints saying, like, I desire to put off this hated body that is the source of all carnal pleasures and all sin and gluttony and all that stuff. And that was quite a stance. And the holy fasting that resulted from it is, I guess, an example of philosophical viewpoints gone extreme, that we can also learn from, and you can see where they're coming from and avoiding the hedonic treadmill, but you can also see the pitfalls of it.
Yeah, and avoiding the hedonic treadmill, but also the potential pitfalls of, and this is just a philosophy, not stating a fact here, but of unrestrained hedonism. So, and this might be one of the criticisms of the hedonic approach to life, is if you just you respond to every hedonic temptation or impulse, then that might result in self-destruction. So if I'm optimizing for pleasure, what's going to prevent me from taking all the drugs and dying, or from cheating on my spouse and having all the sex I want? And that kind of thing.
Because we do, I think it's recognizing and re-recognizing, especially these days. I think we're more at risk for it these days because of the instant gratification that's available everywhere, and the modern kind of privileges that can get people in trouble. Yeah. And I say that not for everyone. I realize, like, there's poverty, there's everything else going on, but I think people would agree that like pursuit of the next shiny smartphone leads to the pursuit of the next thing, and it's not filling up what is really kind of where that void really stems from, because you just kind of keep seeking the next thing. And so what came of that in ancient philosophical thinking was, I think the Epicureans who said, okay, let's look more at the absence of pain, because humans are wired to avoid pain and move towards pleasure. But what if we focus on the absence of pain and then embrace a calm pleasure that comes by the tranquility that you get by not being on this treadmill, and by embracing simple things like solitude, introspection, friendship. And then you've got like other philosophical systems that might, like, even I'm thinking of yoga, like Yoga Sutras talk about like contentment, or like going for a contentment that encompasses the sorrows and the ups and downs in life, a stance of contentment instead of the blips of bliss. Yeah.
Would that be analogous to the so-called middle way?
Yeah, I mean, the middle way
Sort of.
can get applied to a lot of things, and I think it's definitely applicable there, of like walking the middle road that acknowledges the paradox or the dialectical opposing forces of like desire and
Aversion,
wanting pleasure, and aversion, and embracing that in a middle path that is not just recognizing the pitfalls of getting swept too far in either direction, and finding that balanced center.
Yeah, because this is where I see the synergy of a lot of these philosophies showing up in modern psychotherapies. Is we acknowledge mindfully and without judgment and compassionately our impulses and where they came from. And then we also acknowledge that there might be things that we can do that involve self-discipline that could improve our lives, help us live in a way that promotes more of this contentment and peace. and maybe not necessarily jumping on that hedonic treadmill and running as fast as we can to pleasures. It is sort of a middle path, but it's not at one of these extremes above the examples you gave, where I don't have to become an aesthetic that denies all pleasure in order to become holy, and that maybe completely letting go and indulging in a purely hedonistic way is also an extreme that doesn't serve me. But the non-shaming, and we talk about it almost every episode because I think it's so important, the non-shaming approach to it is really, really important, and why I think it finds itself in most modern psychotherapies.
Yeah, and it's an interesting thing trying on philosophy in modern day life and in life period, because you've got these concepts, these examples, these stories, metaphors, parables, riddles, but in the end, like, I think the most valuable thing is your own life, is trying something on, like, okay, what happens when I give into instant gratification? Okay, and you're doing it with that compassionate, stance of, okay, yeah, I gave into that thing again, and I'm realizing more and more that this is, like we'd say in psychotherapy, maladaptive, or moving me away from what I really value in life, instead of, okay, if I can delay a little bit, not delay everything forever, because what is that life? And this is where we all differ. We all end up with our own unique philosophy of living, and we have it whether we like articulate it or not. This is kind of what we're getting just put on that treadmill and staying on it, and in a default mode of hedonism and avoid pain, which is many humans, but or you're trying another way.
Right. Yeah. I'm glad you mentioned this. It's sort of different for all people. I think Aristotle said something like, knowing yourself is the beginning of all wisdom. And your self might be different than another self. And I've been attracted to philosophies that, of course, feel like they harmonize with what it feels like to be me. But my self, my thoughts, my beliefs change over time with new experiences, new information exposed to new thinkers and new people. Yeah. So, self-examination, self-inquiry is an important part of, we've talked a lot about the psychotherapeutic process, but the philosophical process of answering these questions. What does it mean to me and for me?
Yeah. Yeah. And so that's hedonism. But I think the other thing we mentioned that might be worth diving in a little bit on is that idea of virtue or character. I don't know how the terms rub you, but I know some people may not love the word virtue as much these days.
Yeah. I mean, virtue kind of, it makes me think of...
holy? Or?
Yeah, a belief about what is right and wrong. And, if you have right virtues or wrong virtues, and I don't love the judgment that might be baked into that particular conceptualization of virtue, but it makes me think of sort of Aristotle's virtue ethics. And ethics is another, ethics and morality are other words that sort of bring to mind what's right or wrong, but you could repackage it as what's functional or dysfunctional, what's healthy or unhealthy, what's value consistent, what's not value consistent.
Yeah, it's been debated by philosophers while they explore this heavily, and it makes sense because, say you call it character, you can also start to pick that apart as saying one's character is not stable, because we're talking about embracing bravery or courage or whatever. And it's like, some would argue it has this fictitious quality about it, but maybe values encompasses it. But you mentioned Aristotle, and I think his concept of eudaimonia lands in this and has relevance of like how to live a life worth living is, I think, what eudaimonia is getting at.
Which you could make an argument that is relative to the individual. Like I look at other people's lives that appear to be worth living to them, and I'm like, I don't want your life. I wouldn't want your life. And there are some sort of general principles that have been discussed by philosophers about what a life worth living might entail, or even ought to entail. Aristotle talked a lot about the populace, or the sort of the community, It's important to be connected to others and to feel like you're in service to community. And in service to others, that a completely isolated life is not a virtuous life, maybe by his definition.
Yeah, but I think if we can get by the distracting nature of these debatable terms, this is perhaps my favorite bucket of philosophy, because it's the philosophy of working on yourself, right? It's the improving yourself in a direction that feels like good and true and worthwhile for you. And like that eudaimonia, for example, living virtuously, if to use that word, is leads to human flourishing, he would say. And it's hard to argue with that, I'd say, as a general statement, living intentionally with your kind of heart pointed towards being as good a person as you can.
Yeah, I mean, the annoying philosophy student in me wants to ask, well, what does it even mean to be a good person? What is good? What is bad? It seems all relative.
The question, right? That's the question.
But I agree with the point that, it seems like if there is a path to a life worth living, or through a life worth living, that it ought to be oriented to those, or maybe directed by those questions. What matters to me? Why might it matter to me? How might I live in a way that brings the things that matter to me in and protects me from the things that don't out, knowing that it's chaotic and confusing sometimes, and that's okay. It's okay because it is what it is. It's the nature of reality and self.
Yeah, like to use yoga as another example, because like I'm talking about yoga as a philosophy and as a system of living,
not just a way to get flexible hamstrings.
Yeah, and I mean it's all that, right? But it could be whatever. Like some people might call it a religion, even though most people like to say it isn't one, right? Like it's you could make a yoga cult if you wanted. But yoga, like if you pull a yoga system off the shelf, like Ashtanga, the 8-limbed path, which has these 8 limbs that you sequentially work through, they say, wait, before we do any of this and get like yoga powers, we're going to build it on a foundation of ethics. And here are the restraints, and here are the principles of do no harm, ahimsa in Sanskrit, and brahmacharya, or like restraint, and svadhyaya, or like self-knowledge, know thyself. And I think that's really important and often forgotten in like modern renditions of it, is like the values and virtues. Yeah.
Thinking of them as principles can sometimes, I'm just thinking out loud here, can feel restrictive. Like, I don't want rules. I don't want you to tell me what to do and what not to do. But sometimes having principles and guidelines and ethics create a scaffolding. And that with that scaffolding and structure, you can get creative in trying things on, like you were saying earlier in the conversation.
I'm thinking of our past episode on Stoicism and thinking of Ryan Holiday's books. I'd call him a modern day philosopher who has a gift for like writing these concepts in a way that can be useful for us humans these days.
A modern day communicator of ancient philosophy. Like he's good at making it digestible for the modern mind.
Yeah, and what constitutes a philosopher is another interesting question, because you look at a modern day philosopher, perhaps one of my favorites, Alain de Botton, B-O-T-O-N. He's Swiss, has a British accent, but born in Switzerland. I don't know.
It has a French-sounding name.
I don't know his childhood. I should, because he's super cool. But and at first, I just knew him from his books, like Consolations of Philosophy, I think was the first one, and then his course on love. Like he knocks on romanticism in a really cool way, and he tells us to like embrace our crazy. Like, we're all crazy. How are you crazy? I'm this kind of crazy. You want to hang out. But he, like, what's a modern day communicator? What's a modern day philosopher? But I would put him in the bucket of a modern day philosopher who's an expert communicator, helping us access and make sense of relevant philosophies today.
Yeah. I think, quality of a philosopher might be curiosity, might be somebody who can synthesize ideas from multiple different disciplines that seem to be in their own buckets.
Yeah.
Somebody who can look at all the available data and ideas and come up with new takes. So this lover of wisdom, this lover of the mind.
Here's what ChatGPT says philosophy is: the study of fundamental questions about existence, knowledge, values, reasons, mind, and reality. Seeks to understand and analyze the principles and ideas that underlie how we think, act, and perceive the world. That's a lot. There's a lot of stuff. Mm-hmm. Think, act, and perceive.
Yeah.
So Alain de Botton, as an example. One thing I realized after discovering his books, and I think because it came later anyway, was he wrote a book called School of Life. And he has, do you know the YouTube channel, School of Life? Mm-hmm. That's his voice.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. But if you go to the School of Life website, there are kind of buried in there, they have their 8 rules. And because you mentioned rules, I think it'd be fun to look at these and also discuss maybe a little bit what rules means in this context. But but maybe I'll just read some or all, and we can react. But okay, we are accept imperfection is number 1. Right? Sounds pretty cool. Yeah. We work on that with people.
Preach imperfectionism all the time.
Yeah, imperfectionism as a virtue.
Yeah.
We are inherently flawed and broken beings. Perfection is beyond us. Despite our intelligence and science, we will never stamp out stupidity and pain. Life will always continue to be in central ways about suffering. We're all from close up sacred, unsure. Sorry, we're all from close up scared. I did a Freudian philosophical slip. Yeah. Unsure, full of regret, longing, and error. No one is normal. The only people we can think of as normal are those we don't know yet, or we don't yet know very well.
There are some things I like, some things I don't like. Don't love the idea of brokenness and stupidity in there necessarily.
Yeah.
But I do like the spirit of it, of being, it's okay that we're not perfect. We can't necessarily be. I like the idea of normalcy not being a thing. I talk to my clients about that sometimes because, they often want to feel normal. And what is normal? Usually they're just comparing their hardest things to other people's highlight reels and saying, I'm not that, therefore I'm not normal. They're statistically normative, but what does it mean to be a normal person?
And he talks about that, how we judge mental health conditions way too harshly, in that, like, you see someone with a cast, you're like, oh, how did you break your arm? But we don't do that to someone's like substance dependence or their hypervigilance, or like we talked about on here, narcissistic personality disorder, right? But I'm going to jump to his number 3 because it says know your insanity. We cannot, because I think this is good to, deconstruct it a little bit. We cannot be entirely sane, but it's a basic requirement of maturity that we understand the ways in which we are insane, can warn others we care about what our insanities might make us do early and in good time, and before we have caused too much damage, and take constant steps to contain rather than act out our follies. He writes in a certain way.
Yeah, right? it's poetic and provocative.
Yeah, we should be able to have a ready answer and never take offense if someone asks us, as they should, in what ways are you mad? Most of the madness comes down to childhood, which will, in a way unique to our situation, have unbalanced us. No one has yet had a normal childhood. This is no insult to the efforts of families.
Just imagining Reid on a date and asking a casual question, in what ways are you mad? In what ways are you insane? I'll tell you yours if you tell me mine.
Yeah, I wouldn't put that question past me.
I wouldn't either, actually. Yeah. It actually sounds like not a bad thing to talk about when you're prospecting a new potential partner. That for an alliteration.
It's a stance of vulnerability, which happens to be one of his other things. Is like sharing vulnerability. Knowing how to reveal it, like knowing how, right? And there is a way, and an optimal thriving way, perhaps.
Yeah. Yeah, you might be able to make the argument that some of our tightly held beliefs that a therapist might call self-defeating or dysfunctional are a philosophy, right? Like that I shouldn't show vulnerability. There's a should, it's a belief, it's a philosophy about life that maybe you learned when you were young or learned from culture at large.
Yeah.
A philosophy that doesn't serve you. So you get curious and look about the ways that it's impacting you and others, and maybe try on a new philosophy. Maybe because there's some dude's rules that somebody suggested to you, and you've opened yourself up to them, and got some flexibility.
Alain or Brene Brown or whoever said that dope man in the arena quote.
Yeah. Was that Roosevelt?
Yeah.
Maybe.
And so it's a good point. In that way, philosophy is kind of like a lens, or your framework, your compass for life at that time. And coming out of childhood, it's informed by childhood thus far, right? And but yeah, the vulnerability, I like what he says. People don't reliably end up with the lives they deserve. There's no true justice in the way that rewards are distributed. We should embrace the concept of tragedy. Random, terrible things can and do befall most lives. We may fail and be good, and therefore need to be slower to judge and quicker to understand. Those who have failed are not losers. We may soon be among them. Be kind.
But for the grace of God, therefore go I. Yeah, I like...
what are you rambling about?
Well, it's just another philosophy from a different angle that's agrees with him there. I like this idea of embracing the reality of tragedy and chaos. Is something I've just been thinking about lately, and as a way to protect against what we've called toxic positivity. If something really, really terrible happens and you have this belief that this has to be for my good, and certainly there are adaptive ways to respond to tragedies and challenges, but sort of beating yourself over the head because you're struggling with something, or you're deep in grief and you think you quote unquote should be over it by now, or you should learn something from it, can be a mind screw. So just maybe opening yourself up to the chaotic, absurd reality of the world, and that sometimes just terrible shit happens and it's terrible.
Got to see through the absurdity of your own predicament, said Ram Dass in an East Forest track. Yeah.
Another modern philosopher, perhaps.
Yeah, true. And then I'll just jump to his last one, because it's what we were just talking about before, is number 7. Oh, that's not his last one. There's an 8 somewhere.
I thought there were 8 limbs. Despair
cheerfully. We are under undue and unfair pressure to smile, but almost nothing will go in the first... Almost nothing will go entirely well. We could expect frustration, misunderstanding, misfortune, rebuffs. We should be allowed to be melancholy. Melancholy is not rage. It's not bitterness. It is a noble species of sadness that arises when we are open to the fact that disappointment is at the heart of human experience. So he talks about melancholy, which we've riffed about on here and appreciate and do lump fundamentally different than like depression and despair, legitimate despair. But so I'll just read his last paragraph. Though there is a vast amount to feel sad about, we're not individually cursed. And against the backdrop of sadness, many small, sweet things should stand out. A sunny day, a drifting cloud, dawn and dusk, a tender look. Like, this is kind of speaking to us when we find ourselves in depressed times or rough times. With the tragedy of existence firmly in mind, we can take pleasure in a single, uneventful day, some delicate flowers, or an intimate conversation with a friend. When we're not on the hedonic treadmill and things need to get bigger and bigger and immediate, right? We can learn how to draw the full value from what is good, whenever, wherever, and in whatever doses it arises. Despair, but do so cheerfully. Believe in cheerful despair. What do you think of this concept?
Well, when I first heard despair cheerfully, I was, I maybe misunderstood what he was saying. I was thinking like, oh, look on the bright side, be happy, suppress your suppress your negative emotions.
Yeah.
But it's maybe more like open yourself up to the entire spectrum of experience, and despair willingly allow it.
Yeah.
And that by allowing it, by opening up the aperture, you also do see the other things that are worth being cheerful about or delighting in.
Yeah.
Perhaps.
So anyway, that's a little list from Alain that I appreciate.
One philosophical scaffold that one could use to investigate themselves and to work on eudaimonia, the good life.
Living your best life, essentially.
Yeah.
Whatever that is for you.
Well, we're just about out of time. I've got a bunch of just random philosophical quotes.
Give me some randomness. Let's have a quote stream.
How about the Heraclitus' river? No man ever steps in the same river twice, for it is not the same river, and he is not the same man. Embracing change. Just because you are the way you are now doesn't mean you can't be something different in the next moment, the next day. So I like it because it kind of explains what it's like to be a person in some ways, but also opens you up to possibility and change. I'm not doomed.
Embraces change that we also tend to feel scared of, but it's ever present.
One that was attributed to the Buddha: do not dwell in the past, do not dream of the future. Concentrate the mind on the present moment.
Be here now.
Be here now, right?
Yeah.
The Stoics, a lot of it's just about similar, like present moment focus, but Epictetus. You have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this, and you will find strength. Seneca says something similar. We suffer more in imagination than in reality. And you can see the influence in cognitive behavioral therapy and other cognitive therapies from the Stoic philosophers in those kinds of quotes.
Yeah. What did, is there a Ryan Holiday book that has the word discipline in it that may be on your shelf? Or freedom in it?
There's Ego is the Enemy.
Discipline is freedom or something?
Discipline is freedom might be his.
Yeah.
Discipline equals freedom might be Jocko Willink, actually, the Navy SEAL commander. But obstacle is the way, ego is the enemy, and stillness is the key are sort of the Stoicism trilogy from him.
Yeah, I was just trying to remember if there was a title of his because we were talking about discipline.
Yeah, I think discipline equals freedom is Jocko Willink's, but again, it's sort of an enlightened discipline, I think, not the asceticism that we were talking about before. Lots of fun quotes. You could get one of those calendars that has a philosophical quote for each day as you peel away and use it for inspiration. One philosophy that I'm playing with now is, and I guess you could call it a philosophy, is a meditative path by Henry Shulkman.
I love.
Who's a teacher.
Cloud Sangha.
Yeah,
he's awesome.
So he's got an app called The Way, and I just started using it.
Cool. I haven't tried it
because I heard one of Tim Ferriss's podcasts, where he was talking about Shulkman, and I think it was the Random Show with Kevin Rose, and Shulkman is Kevin's like meditation teacher and current guru or whatever. So they were talking about like, Tim, why are you so chill? You're usually not a chill guy. You're usually neurotic as hell. He's like, well, I've been using this app. And Tim is somebody who's had experience with transcendental meditation. He did that a lot for a long time. And
he's dabbled in many things.
Many things.
Tango.
Psychedelics, tango. What was it?
AG1.
Tai Chi, slap boxing, a lot of different things.
Slap boxing,
He's a pretty interesting fellow.
But if
that's what inspired me to try this out.
Oh, cool. Are you calmer than you've ever been?
I've done like 2 sessions, so not quite yet. I'll get there.
Stay tuned.
Everyone
watch Steve.
For serene, enlightened Steve.
But Henry Shulkman's story of his awakening I found really interesting. I think he told it on, if you search Tim Ferriss's podcast back to a couple years ago, there was 1 or 2 episodes, and where he tells a story of, he had this skin condition, like some scleroderma perhaps, a really painful skin condition. And I think it was that prompted this awakening to start kind of cracking open the way he saw reality. And then, led him on this path where he's, teaching kind of meditation philosophy, if you will.
It's a good example of the obstacle being the way. It's not uncommon for pain to inspire us to look for answers and lead to the accumulation of interesting answers.
Yeah, and
interesting life paths.
Philosophy helps you. There's my alarm.
There's our stop talking alarm.
So philosophy would be what helps you look to the pain and look to yourself and simultaneously have compassion for the tragedy, the suffering, and also say, thank you for the pain that shook me awake and taught me this lesson or altered my course, for example.
Well said, Dr. Robison. It's been a pleasure talking philosophy with you today.
Likewise, Dr. Steve. Let's do it again sometime.
Until next time. Psychedelic Therapy Frontiers is brought to you by Numinous Network, a company committed to helping people heal and be well by delivering technology-driven clinic support, clinical trial research, and comprehensive practitioner training in psychedelic-assisted therapy. You can learn more about Numinous Network at numinous.com. That's numinus.com. If you enjoyed the show today and you want to support us, here's how you do it. You can leave a rating or review on places like Apple Podcasts and Spotify, subscribe to the Numinous YouTube channel, like the YouTube videos, and share the show with somebody you think might enjoy it. If you're interested in comprehensive training in psychedelic-assisted therapy, check out our courses at numinous.com/training. These courses are carefully crafted by Numinous professionals like myself, Reid, and others, and include live online classes, experiential learning, and opportunities to connect with a diverse community of practitioners in the psychedelic medicine space. I really love teaching these courses and connecting with you all, so check out numinous.com/training, and I hope to see you at the next training cohort. The content of this podcast does not constitute medical advice or mental health treatment. Please consult with a medical or mental health professional if you believe you are in need of mental health treatment.